Hello and welcome to Tech Deals AMD RX Vega 56 full review, 33 benchmarks, sound, noise, and temperature information all included in this video. Comparison to the GTX 1070, 1070 Ti, 1080, and the 1080 Ti. I've got a ton of results to show you in this video. But first of all, what is RX Vega 56? Who should consider buying it? And maybe who shouldn't? RX Vega is a new line of high-performance graphics cards designed to compete at the high end of performance with the 1070 and higher from NVIDIA. It does not replace the RX 580 and 570 that came before. Those are designed to compete with the 1050 and 1060 series of lines. Now, this card retails for $400, and it is currently available on the day I recorded this video for $400 from Newegg. Links to all the cards I'm discussing to both Amazon and Newegg will be down in the video description below. As always, if you find my videos helpful and useful, please use those links when shopping. It does make a difference. Now, the Vega 64 is $100 more than this, and there's also a Vega 64 liquid-cooled, but those cards will be covered in a future review. In fact, if you look behind me, that silver card back there on my test bench is the liquid-cooled Vega 64. I'm actually not done finished testing it. I will have both of those in an upcoming review. Spoiler alert on the upcoming review of the Vega 64, the deal, the value for the money, is by far the Vega 56. Now, the Vega 64 is of course faster, but for 20% more money, it's not 20% faster. And if you're buying a card like this in terms of temperature, power, noise, heat, etc., for $400, this really is probably the one you want to look at. If you want more performance than either one of these, well, hey, that's what GeForce GTX 1080 Ti is for. I am including those benchmark results in this video simply to demonstrate how much higher the 1080 Ti really is than the 1080, 1070, and of course the Vega 56. But it is more expensive, and I understand that most people who are looking at a $400 card maybe don't want to spend $700 or $800, but it's here just for comparison purposes. In just a minute, 33 benchmarks on all 5 cards, but I want to talk about these in general and why I chose these cards before we get to them. First of all, the GTX 1070 today is the wonderful EVGA for the win. It is a factory overclock card. It runs at 2 gigahertz out of the box. No adjustment by the user required. Now, this card is slightly over $400. You can get 1070s for $400. This is available for about $20 or $30 over $400. Is it worth it? It is actually, in my opinion. If you've got the extra money and you have the room for this card, I really love the For the Win from EVGA. But MSI and Gigabyte also make great cards. It's really a brand preference. As I've covered before, there's very little performance difference between various cards, but this thing is quiet and fast. Now, the Vega 56 is the reference card. You can see here we have the single fan. This is the blower. In November of 2017, when I'm recording this, this is the only Vega 56 available. The aftermarket coolers, the factory overclock cards from Sapphire and MSI and Gigabyte are not yet available. Will they be? When they be? I don't know. No firm dates have been announced on availability. If in the future they come out and they're faster, I will come back and revisit this video and show these results versus whatever comes out in the future. But for the moment, this is what we've got for Vega 56. The Vega 56 and 64 line does have some nice benefits over the NVIDIA cards beyond just raw performance. As I said, it's going to beat the 1070 in some cases and lose to it in others. But putting aside performance for a minute, let's talk about FreeSync 2 support, one of the biggest single reasons why you might want to consider this card. If you have a 1080p or 1440p FreeSync monitor and you want to use the adaptive refresh rate technology to allow the graphics card and the monitor to sync up, run at the speed of the game, and not have any vertical tearing or have to turn on VSync and introduce input lag, then you're going to need either a Vega 56 or down to the RX 580, but those are lower performance. If you want high-end performance, it's basically Vega or bust. Now, if you have a G-Sync monitor, G-Sync would be on the NVIDIA side. So basically, there's 2 competing monitor standards. G-Sync monitors are NVIDIA, FreeSync monitors are AMD. It's good that we have that, and if that's important to you, well, Vega's here. AMD also has the lead in the compute department. In terms of non-gaming applications, if you're doing 3D animation, if you're doing rendering, if you're doing GPU compute, non-gaming applications, the reality is the performance benchmarks I'm about to show you today don't apply. The Vega 56 is faster than the GTX 1070. In fact, frankly, it's faster than a 1080 and really competes very well with the 1080 Ti in dedicated compute applications. This is not gaming. Gaming is a separate category. But if you do either scientific compute, Bitcoin mining, or other types of work, well, Bitcoin mining is really ASICs, but if you do Ethereum mining or other types of mining, then Vega is definitely superior. Now, that's not a typical user application. The average person watching this video is not going to use the compute power of this card nearly as much as they're going to use the gaming power. But if you are interested in raw compute performance outside of games, Vega definitely is the winner here. All of the Vega reference cards include 4 DisplayPort 1.4s for 4K 60Hz displays and a single HDMI 2.0 port also for 4K 60Hz, either to a television or to monitors. All of these cards do require 2 8-pin PCI Express power connectors, and they really do need them. Unlike some of these cards, which maybe have 2 and don't really need them, and some of the 1070s and 1080s only have 1, that really needs them. In fact, honestly, if you're getting a Vega, get us at least a 600 watt power supply. I've used GTX 1070s on 400 watt power supplies. You could probably use this on about a 550 or so, maybe a 500, but I wouldn't go below it. I've seen more than 400 watts drawn from the wall with this on that test bench. It does pull substantially more power. Speaking of higher levels of power draw, it also has higher temperatures and makes more noise. That single blower fan has to really work to expel all the heat produced by this card. Now, I did use my sound meter to actually measure the sound. Now, this is an inexpensive sound meter. I don't have a noise isolation chamber per se, but I did move it around to various parts to make sure that I was getting the sound from the fan and the card and not from the rest of the system. It's easier on the test bench because all the fans are on the bottom underneath the actual cage itself. So basically, it's just a graphics card sitting on top by itself. I'm also going to show you as I'm speaking the results from the For the Win 1070 here, which is up to 20 decibels quieter. It is much cooler running, it is much quieter running, pulls far less power, and has, give or take, roughly the same performance. Now, I know that a lot of people are AMD fans. I'm an AMD fan. AMD's Ryzen processors are awesome, and I really hope that the next generation of Vega shows the same low power draw and low temperatures of Ryzen. My understanding is that Vega was actually designed before the current Ryzen chips were. This has been in the works for a while now, and hopefully Vega 2 sees the same power draw and temperature reductions that we saw with Ryzen, because Ryzen is a vast improvement over the previous FX line of processors, which were hot and power hungry. Unfortunately, as it stands now at the end of 2017, you're going to see anywhere from 120 to 150 watts lower power consumption from a 1070. You're going to see up to 20 decibels lower sound. That is a massive sound difference between the Vega 56 and the GTX 1070. Now, I am comparing a For the Win, which has large, very slow turning fans. Some of the smaller 1070s will be a bit louder and be a bit closer, but none of the 1070s are going to be as loud as that Vega 56 was. All of the results you're about to see, with the exception of the 1070 Ti, which I'm including both stock and overclocked because of NVIDIA, all the results on the other cards are at the out-of-the-box speeds. Now, this is factory overclocked to 2 GHz, but it does run at 2.1 just fine if you manually overclock it. RX Vega is absolutely overclockable, but you're going to either have temp issues or you need to turn up the fan speed. Now, I'm not going to talk over this because it's quite loud, but what happens when you turn the fan speed up on RX Vega? Have a listen. That is 85 decibels. That is over 4,500 RPM. Now, that's at 100% speed. You could try to find some speed in the middle that is tolerable. The reality is that is just absolutely atrocious. I would not overclock this card because while you can, the noise and the temperature just gets, to be blunt, ridiculous. I like the promise of Vega. I'm not thrilled with the current implementation of Vega. Hopefully, either we get some aftermarket cards with better coolers, or perhaps AMD takes the knowledge they gained with Ryzen and puts it towards Vega 2 next year, and we can have perhaps a bit more of a competitive environment. Okay, enough talking, on with the benchmarks. Our first benchmark chart is 3D Mark, the 3D graphics benchmark. These were all tested on the i7-8700K 5 GHz fixed clock speed with 16 GB of DDR4 3200 MHz RAM. Now, the legend down at the bottom lists which card is which, but essentially the red bars are the RX Vega 56 and the orange bar is the GTX 1070 for the win. And then you've got the 1070 Ti, 1080, and 1080 Ti. In this chart, you can see that the Vega 56 and the 1070 for the win trade places. In the Firestrike Extreme, for example, which is 1440p, the RX Vega is slightly faster. In the Time Spy test, the GTX 1070 is slightly faster. These are rounding errors. These cards are essentially the same performance when it comes to a synthetic 3D benchmark. Our next test is VR Mark, the virtual reality benchmark. Now here, the RX Vega 56 falls a little bit behind. Part of this is due to the fact that I've got one of the best 1070s on the market here. A less expensive model will be a touch closer, but we're talking a difference of maybe 200 points plus or minus. Likewise, you could also overclock the RX Vega to get it closer, but we're looking at about a 5% difference here. It's not large. Now, the blue room on the right is the future test. That's for future games, not really current hardware, but it gives you an idea of how much room you have. As you can see here, add more performance, get more performance. There's a very clean stair step as you move up these graphics cards. The next benchmark chart is the Unigine tests, Heaven, Valley, and Superposition. Heaven and Valley are a bit older, but they've been used by a ton of reviewers over the years. Superposition is brand new for 2017. Now, in all three of these tests, the RX Vega 56 again falls slightly behind, but not by too much, especially in the brand new Superposition test. Yes, there's a couple hundred points difference, but it's not major. Don't sweat it too much. Notice that as you move up in the cards to the 1070, 1070 Ti, and 1080, you do get a nice jump in performance. Take a look at the purple bar. That is the 1080 Ti. Really, that card is misnamed. I know we're not reviewing the 1080 Ti here, but I would just like to point out that card really should have been called the 1090. It is dramatically faster than a 1080 and really deserves its own name. Same test, but this time the FPS or the frame rate per second rather than the synthetic score generated by the actual benchmark itself. Notice here that there's actually about a 25% frame rate difference between the RX Vega 56 and the GTX 1070. The Heaven and Valley tests are older and really love the NVIDIA cards and don't do that well on Vega. Notice Superposition is much, much closer. Now, Superposition is brand new, latest technologies, and it's only 5 frames per second difference. So essentially, this is going to cover what you're going to see in other games. Older games tend to do much better on the NVIDIA cards, whereas brand new DirectX 12 titles do very well on RX Vega. Next up, we have the same chart, but in a dollar cost per frame per second. Again, this is the Unigine FPS. What I've done is I've put the retail prices of the cards down at the bottom. You will have to adjust this if the cards are a different price for you or when you're watching this video. So $400 each for the RX Vega 56 and 1070, and then $450, $500, and $700 for the more expensive cards. Taking the previous chart's frame rate and dividing it by the cost, you get $4.40 per frame per second on the first two tests on RX Vega and $4.26 per frame per second on Superposition. Notice that the GTX 1070, in light of being the same cost and faster, is lower cost per frame. Notice the 1070 Ti and the 1080 are very, very close. They are more expensive, but not by much. And then you've got the super fast 1080, which actually is a reasonable value for the money. It costs more than the 1070, but if you're looking for that level of performance, it's not actually that overpriced. It's pretty reasonable for what you get. And that moves us on to our first gaming benchmark, Mankind Divided. DirectX 12 was tested, and this shows how good in DirectX 12 Vega 56 can be. 103 frames per second at 1080p on Vega versus 91 frames per second on the GTX 1070. So Vega absolutely is superior when given modern games, modern APIs. Vulkan DirectX 12, it does really, really well. In fact, in order to beat it, you actually have to step up to a 1080, in which case then you get 112 frames per second. Of course, it doesn't compete with the 1080 Ti, which does 144 and completely stomps it, but it nearly doubled the price, so Vega does really well here. Now we have Far Cry Primal, another relatively recent game, and you can see here that they trade blows throughout the chart. In 1080p average detail, you get 126 frames per second on Vega versus 124 on the 1070. Now on the minimums, 1080p, it reverses a bit, 107 to 111. These cards are virtually interchangeable, as you can see here. Now, of course, spend more, get more. You can see the 1080 does 146, and then you get a nice jump up to 166 frames per second with the 1080 Ti. That card is a beast. Moving on to For Honor, high detail, take a look at the 1440p numbers. If you have a 100Hz 1440p monitor, for average frame rate, either of these cards are fine. 97 to 99 frames per second in the average, and then 82 and 79 in the minimum. So one card's slightly faster in the average, the other card is slightly faster in the minimum. But if you have a 1440p 144Hz monitor and you actually want to use it, notice that the only real choice you have for that level of performance is a 1080 Ti. That card is incredible. I know we're not reviewing it, but I talk about it on my channel a lot. I talk about it in my live streams. If you want 144 frames per second at 1440p, it really is the only card to buy. Ghost Recon Wildlands, one of my favorite games of 2017. I just beat this the other day, and I did it on a live stream. Hopefully you were all there. This game is incredibly punishing, but it's very smooth in terms of scaling of performance. Give it more graphics card, and it does better. At 1080p, these cards will absolutely give you an average of almost 100 frames per second, at least in the built-in benchmark. The actual gameplay is a bit slower, and the minimums are in the 70s to 80s. If you want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands at high detail at 1440p resolution, any of these cards will do just fine, but I would point out that the minimums in live gameplay, this is the built-in benchmark here, will dip down to 50 or a little bit below that when you're actually playing the game. If you want to maintain above 60 frames per second in the minimums, you'll actually need a 1080 just to do that. On the flip side, if you want to set your monitor to 60 Hz, turn VSync on, and have a perfect 1080p gaming experience, then you want to skip the RX 580 and skip the GTX 1060, get a RX Vega 56 or a GTX 1070 for the ultimate 1080p gaming experience, or in this case, high detail. Next up, we have Grand Theft Auto 5. Ignore the 1080p and to some extent the 1440p numbers. This game is frame rate limited and it gets really jumpy and stuttery when you actually give it too much performance. It's a fault of the game engine. It's been covered by other channels in the past. I won't go into that detail, but that's why the minimums are all over the place at the 1080p. I include them simply because people would want to see them, but ignore them. If you want to see the scaling of performance, at least look at the 1440p average or the 4K numbers if you want to see how it scales. I tested this at high detail. If any game here deserved to have the details cranked to the max on these cards, this would be it because it's so CPU bound and it is in fact frame rate limited and, as I said, gets really jumpy if you don't. Next up, we have our best performing game in this series, Rainbow Six Siege. Kind of a hybrid. It's not quite a AAA game. It's not quite an esports game, but it kind of performs like one. It really, you don't need this much graphics card in order to play this game, at least not at 60 frames per second. But if you're an ultra competitive gamer playing at 1080p, perhaps you're live streaming and you want 200 plus frames per second, take a look at RX Vega. You've got 238 frames per second average with a 132 minimum. In fact, to get the minimum much higher, you got to jump to a 1080 Ti, which is a whole pile bunch more money. So RX Vega 56 does very well in this game. Rise of the Tomb Raider, again, DirectX 12 was tested. At 1080p, the RX Vega 56 falls a little bit below the GTX 1070, but take a look at the minimums. We have a minimum of 84 frames per second versus a minimum of 66 on the 1070. So the average isn't as high, but the minimum's better. Take a look at 1440p. Again, the 1070 beats the RX Vega 56 by 1 frame per second on the average, but the Vega 56 beats it by 6 frames per second on the minimum. So basically, you're trading a little bit of top-end performance for better minimums. And our last game tested today is The Division, another game I've beaten and quite enjoyed. It had an epic last battle sequence. Notice the higher numbers here, 117 frames per second at 1080p average versus 98 frames per second 1080p average on the 1070. Notice the situation with minimums is reversed. The minimums on Vega 56 are lower here than they were on the other game, but the averages are higher. So frankly, your performance is going to totally depend upon what game you're playing, whether or not the averages or minimums are higher. This is why I test multiple games. But basically, both of these cards are really nice, and it simply comes down to your personal preference as to what works for you. There you have it, 33 benchmarks run on 5 different cards, 6 results because the 1070 Ti was both stock and overclocked because NVIDIA is not letting companies ship it factory overclocked out of the box the way they are with these. Let me be blunt, unless you really have to have FreeSync support, buy a 1070. The Vega is hot, the Vega is loud, and in most circumstances out of the box, it is a bit slower than a GTX 1070. Not all. There are times it's faster, and if you need compute and or don't care about the noise, it's fine. It does the job, it does everything promised, it's just hot and loud, and, well, it is what it is. Hopefully, as I said before, Vega 2 next year does a better job, or perhaps aftermarket coolers fix that, but for now, well, I think 1070 is the smarter choice for most people. The one exception to that might be, if you really need compute and FreeSync, the Vega 64 liquid cooled might be worth considering. I have run it and tested it, but I haven't finished the testing. It is noticeably cooler and noticeably quieter than this card is. That review will be coming up soon. Like this video if you like it, share it with your friends if you loved it. Remember to subscribe to my channel to get notifications of when that comes out using the big red button directly below. Links in the video description take you to Amazon and Newegg. Again, if this was helpful and informative, it was many hours of testing, please use those links in the description below. It really does help. Links to Twitter, Twitch, and Patreon are also down there as well. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.